Thanks for having me. My name is McKee. I'm the VP of Engineering at Cirrus Identity. And I wanted to talk today about engineering governable access control. And this is a conversation that Rob and I had when I said, I will talk about literally any identity topic, but what are some things that we don't talk about enough? Well, governance is something we all know is important. We all tend to kind of see places where we wave hands about it. I would argue and will argue today that it's something that starts at sort of the program engineering and the software engineering level. And I want to talk about that because I think setting yourself up for governance is something that you need to do super early in the process, and I want to talk about what that looks like. So, because this is a back to basics talk, I want to just say a painfully obvious opener. This is a information security session. We're all information security practitioners. And we all know that our jobs are about making sure that we are preventing unauthorized access to organizational resources. And it follows that in order to prevent unauthorized access, you kind of have to know what authorized access looks like, and you need to be able to do that at scale and in a reliable way. So, if you squint, even though this is like a subset of information technology, I think access control ultimately all boils down to some form of access control. And I want to talk about sort of the patterns that you can see, not only in your identity programs, but beyond that. So, one question that I have is why do we struggle so much with access control? Because it's a pretty straightforward prompt, right? We want to make sure that the right people get into the right things. We know what the things are. Ostensibly, we know who the people are. Why do we struggle with that so much? I have some theories that I will share shortly, but I think that a lot of it starts with our tooling, and I think a lot of it starts with our process, and a lot of it starts with sort of the common, conventional wisdom that we get, a lot of which is actually very anti-security. And so one thing I hope that you take away from this conversation is some things that you've heard over and over again as incontrovertible truths of identity that are actually holding you back and getting you in trouble. And before I do that, I want to make sure that you know, why would you listen to me on this? Anyone here who knows me probably knows me from my career at Duke, where I spent a decade doing software development, and then I got into the identity space, and I ended up in cybersecurity leadership. I was the deputy CISO for the university, working closely with some of these folks here. I've since gone to Cirrus Identity, which is a small company that does identity solutions that are really kind of minimalist, less is more, get the job done without a lot of extra nonsense. They're not sponsoring this, so I'm not going to tell you about Cirrus Identity Solutions, but if you want to talk about them after this, I would be happy to talk about that. Today, we're not going to talk about tools. We're just going to talk about where having even the best tools, even having Cirrus Identity tools, is not going to be enough to save you, and how you can do better. So to approach that, I kind of break this into two things. What are the two things that go wrong in every identity modernization project, and then how can you make it right? So the two things that go wrong, everybody's going to tell you, if you've got money, we can fix it. That's obviously a biased position for people to take. People will also say, if you have the right process, you can fix it. And I'm going to take some shots at that too. I want to talk today about how access control, just like cybersecurity in general, is an incentives problem, and how we can look at the economics of incentive management and incentive design to get people to want to be secure and to get people to do the right thing. Because if you have to do it all by fiat, I think we know you're not going to be able to get your jobs done. So this is the first section where I have to tell you that you cannot solve access control with money. And to do this, I'm going to say from previous jobs working with various identity teams, I've seen a lot of pitches from a lot of different identity vendors, and they all try to sell you the same thing. And that is basically, we're going to take a human problem and an incentives problem, and we're going to ignore that problem, but we're going to give you a shiny new tool, and we're going to spend years migrating a bunch of stuff into that shiny new tool, and then voila, governance. And anything that we say in that process of, hey, we've got our controls are scattered, they're all over the place, we really want to have the single pane of glass where we can manage everything. The problem is that's all implementation. That's all after you sign on the dotted line. And moving your data, moving your access controls is not going to be enough. It's one of those things where we're ignoring the root cause. The root cause is, why is your access so scattered? Where is that coming from? And how can you address that at the root? Because it's great I will love to talk to anyone here about tools. I love tools. I love building tools. I love talking about what makes for a good identity tool. But even if you have the best identity tool, you have to deal with the culture issue first. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're focusing all of your time on the data. In that implementation screen, I think a lot of people have seen this XKCD comment about standards and how they proliferate. You see it a lot with IAM modernization projects. People acquire a new, shiny new tool, and they say, hey, let's get all of our stuff into the new tool. And they get a couple easy wins in, and that's good. And then the hits start coming. You have technical limitations. You're not getting a way to decommission any of your old systems. Now you have this new system, but you can't get your stuff into it. You can't really see the end. And the whole reason you got into this was to have all your access centralized in one place, but it's just getting harder and harder to do it. And in the end, you end up exactly where you began. And a lot of times you'll see people who have their shiny new identity system. The shiny new identity system is now yet one more legacy system that you're having to deal with when you're doing account investigations, and it's not solving your problem. So this, in the end, is sort of where we see over and over again that if the core of your strategy for modernizing your access control is having the right tool, it's not going to be enough. That takes us to the point I want to make today, which is, the tool isn't the primary thing. Again, I love tools. I love to talk about tools. But it's the strategy that's going to make or break you. And everyone in this room who has any piece of any information security part of the puzzle at your organization can be doing something to make yourself better, regardless of whether you're in a place where you can be acquiring fancy new tools. So it's, far be it for me to say don't upgrade your identity tools, but there's something here for everyone, I hope. The next thing I want to say about where I see people's IAM modernization strategy go wrong is with process. There's a lot of debate about process. There's a lot of debate about what is the best way, what is the best structure, what is the access management paradigm that's going to save you. There's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of debate. And it's all good stuff, but it's also pretty overwhelming. So, old school stuff, we talk about discretionary access control, which is like access control lists, which is just managing, this is my list of people who are authorized to something. Then we see people who say, well, that's not really scalable, so let's do like a role-based access control kind of thing, or an attribute-based access control, or a policy-based access control, or a claims-based access control. You'll hear all of these things, and the paradigms are overwhelming. You find that your stakeholders are all going to want to influence you because there is this pervasive idea that if you pick the right thing, you will go to the promised land. And I want to say that access control paradigms are overwhelming. They're also super political. So if you think about a conversation where people are talking about what is the right access control paradigm, we're here in an election year, we're not going to get into politics, but I'm pretty sure there's nobody in this room who would say, what would solve all of our problems is to change our government structure. And that's it. We're going to just pick the best structure, and then all of our problems are going to go away. I think we all intuitively know that it's not that the governmental structure doesn't matter. It's not that there aren't reasonable arguments that some are better than others. But it's not really the focal point, because how you implement any structure and what the context for that structure is matters so much more than what the structure itself is. So one thing I hope you take away from this talk is that if anyone tells you, oh yeah, the best way to do access control is this paradigm, that like star back, whatever the based access control is, that's a red flag, because it's not something that's generalizable. It's something that's very nuanced, very context specific, and also kind of not the point. And with apologies to anyone who doesn't know this meme, it's not the point. Ultimately, all access control is discretionary. Whether you change how it's discretionary by saying, hey, we make it based on attributes, so instead of assigning first-hand access, we're saying we're going to take this attribute, and whoever assigns the attribute, now they get the access, or we're going to take a look at this behavior. Somebody's making rules, and that means that it is ultimately discretionary. So when we talk about modernization and what these new paradigms are offering us, they're not offering you something that is less subjective. They're offering you something that is more scalable. And they're doing that because there's a market. We have more access. We have to scale up our access. But the more you scale your access, the more complicated all of this becomes. And you really have to have a strategy for dealing with things being discretionary. So let's talk about how we deal with things being discretionary. And to start, I want to do a little bit of a nightmare scenario thinking, which is imagine the DEF CON social engineering booth. Imagine like the best social engineer in the world. And imagine that they're calling your service desk trying to get access to an account. This is somebody who reminds people of their grandmother, super unassuming, somebody who is just so smooth and knows exactly what they want. Are they getting into your system? Especially if they can, call over and over again. You get one shot at defining the controls. They get as many times as they can call you. When you're thinking about whether people are getting into your systems in this kind of situation where you've got a very, very skilled social engineer who's trying to get into your systems, you have to think about where the motivations are. So think about that service desk analyst. Think about all the incentives that that social engineer is creating and manifesting expertly to help get access. And then think about what you've put in place to manage the incentives for them not giving access. And a lot of that is, do they clock that there's a risk? Do they understand that they have an obligation? I think probably the killer thing is, even if they don't believe that the person is harmful, do they still see value in implementing your control? Because that's an important thing. It's important to say, even though this person reminds me of my grandma, and I'm sure that they really are on vacation and lost their MFA codes, I still have to go through the process. And if you can't do that, then you are really in a disadvantaged position. And that's something that, as we talk about, access control systems are constantly being re-engineered for scale because we're constantly dealing with more and more scale. This is a place where we have to make sure that those incentives scale. So if all access management is ultimately discretionary, it all boils down to, at the end of the day, somebody's making some decision about under what conditions people can get access, then all access management is socially engineerable, and that is a place where we need to start. Social engineers are going to create incentives to bypass controls, and a good IAM strategy is going to push back by having equal or greater things to enforce the controls on the other side. So to talk a little bit about what does that look like? How do you take that, like, okay, I agree, thanks for reminding me that my job is very difficult. I want to transition into solutions here. So I want to talk about an economic principle that some of you may be familiar with, like a principal-agent problem. Principal-agent problem is a description in economics of a situation where you have hired someone, you are the principal, and you've hired an agent to work on your behalf. So an example of that would be you're selling a house. You get a realtor, and your realtor is there to work for you. Or you are investing money, and you get a financial analyst or financial expert to help you with your money. It's not as easy as, the person is just going to always be incentivized to do the best thing for you. We hope that that's true, and we do our best to make sure that that's true. And if it was a room of people from any other profession, I would feel like I needed to explain why that may not always be true. But in this situation, I think that we can all agree that we can't rest our security strategy on hope, right? We can't hope that everyone is going to always do the right thing. That's not a scalable security strategy. So if we think about a principal-agent problem and the idea that you are expecting other people to make access decisions to protect your organization, what does that look like? So let's apply that language. Imagine you have a user needs access to, they're calling the service desk, they want to get their password reset. They talk to an agent. Let's say the agent is a service desk person. The agent is listening to directives, hopefully, that were set by a principal. Where's security in this structure?
Advising the principal on what directives to set the agent.
Thank you. Shelley says, advising the principal. And that is the most important thing. If you take nothing else from the time that you've spent listening to this today, please avoid letting your security team become the principal at all costs. It is far too common, and you fail before you even begin. And I want to talk about that a little bit and why that fails. But it's very natural, and I want to just say it's very natural to say we need to work with the people giving access directly to make sure that they are securing our organization. We're the security people. Who better than us to do it? It totally makes sense, and it's totally going to sabotage your access management program. if you don't want to sabotage it, you need to position security as an advocate to the principal. And the reason for that is that a user and an agent are always going to be more proximate than an agent and a principal. Users call the agent every day. Users call, people that work at service desks call, and they take calls from callers every single day. How often do they talk to the person who makes that rule? And how often do they talk to somebody who is adversely affected by them not giving the access in the way that they were supposed to give it? It's very difficult. So it advantages users and disadvantages security if you have this imbalance where the users and the agents can kind of be, they can bond, and the principal gets kind of pushed out to the side. Meanwhile, the principal is always going to need outside backup. They're going to need someone to say, hey, you know what, that's not fair. That person's responsible for securing that thing. We need to make sure that we have these people trained up, that we need to have these controls in place. And that's a place where security can be super, super effective. But only if you first cultivate, as part of your governance journey, who are going to be the resource owners in this environment. And it can't be security, because then security can't be the advocate, and then you're already working at a disadvantage. So making sure that security can be stronger as an advocate to the principal than being the principal themselves, this is something where you kind of balance out that structure. And it can be hard to do, but it's one of those things where we often see, like, all right, let me come in here and fix this. But you really can't come in there and fix it. You have to find a way to cultivate that resource ownership, cultivate other principles, and then support those principles so that you can find that happy balance that is security forward. So I want to talk about this in terms of cooperative game theory. And I came across this concept called Pareto efficiency, which is like, what is a system where you can't take away resources from one person and give them to another without leaving people worse off. It is an idea of how do you make sure that in a cooperative game, like we're all here in the same escape room, right? We're all trying to meet the same goals. How do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that feels fair? And I think when security acts as an advocate, you have the ability to function sort of as a referee. So that's something that I think is very compelling to people when you're having conversations. Instead of you being the heavy saying, you got to do this, and you're getting resistance. You're there trying to say, look, we've got these two parties. We have to balance these two things out, and we can't leave security, just hanging in that process. So this section is about trying to distribute access, authority, and accountability in a security promoting way. And I think that that is really how governance needs to be engineered. It's how your access control needs to be engineered in order for it to all flow smoothly from there. So isn't it nice when you get to be the good guy? Going back to the principal advocate thing. If you are the principal, it's pro-fairness to compromise security. And why does fairness matter? Fairness matters because, again, we can't do everything by fiat. I don't think there's a single person in this room who has the authority to make everyone do everything all the time under any circumstances in the name of security. We probably wouldn't even want that, right? We want people to be engaged. If you look at anything about negotiating, one thing that will consistently come out in research about negotiation is that people are very, very motivated by an idea of fairness. And people will sabotage good deals because they don't feel fair. So if you want people to embrace your security policy, it has to feel fair. And that's something where we want security to be the principal or to be the advocate, because if security is the principal, then it's pro-fairness to start making concessions for your own policy, your own stance. You can say, oh, well, I don't know, are we doing too much security? Maybe we're not being fair to everyone else. But if you're there as the advocate, then you're able to say, okay, well, let's make sure that we're not doing something. It's not fair to expect that somebody who's a risk owner is now out of compliance with something. It's not fair to expect every service owner to do their own identity proofing when we have a centralized identity team that can do it. It's not fair to expect every department to figure out security compliance when we can run a program and we can offer these resources. And that way, you're not the bad guy or gal. You are the person who's coming in to say, these are realities of our work, and we're here to provide a service for something that is a shared win. So I want to make sure, just keeping an eye on time here. Some common ideas or common examples of places where I see regularly what people tend to do in access management skews the incentives in a way that is not helpful, and give you a couple thoughts about how to fix them. So the first thing is access reviews, which access reviews are not generally very useful, but sometimes they are necessary. Sometimes we don't have a better tool. Sometimes we have to do them. It's unfair when you ask someone to say, yep, all of this access is good, when they have no idea who has the access, who should have the access, or they have no authority to reduce the amount of access. You're asking someone to take risk for something that they can't fix. It's not fair if you ask someone to do an access review and they have no idea what access is appropriate. I would say, and this is just out of my head, I would say if there's more than 50 entities, and that's not saying people, but entities, things that need to be reviewed, whether they be a group or a person, you probably have some cleanup you need to do in your access so that those access reviews can be meaningful. I think that the way that you make access reviews more fair is you start out with, well, let's make sure that we're not delegating to people who have no power to make things better. If it's a big hassle, then maybe that's something that should be a priority to work through. The people that are able to fix things, let's try to fix them. There are always ways that security can show up as an advocate to the principal saying, hey, we do have tooling, you can work with us. Going back to the beginning of this where I said, a lot of times you'll get resistance moving people to your great new security tool. One great way to get them to move to the security tool is to say, hey, if you move it to the tool, you get this automated deprovisioning, you get automated access, you won't have to do that sort of access review. And I think it's really important, especially with access reviews, to have no tolerance for security theater, because it really undermines the program. I don't need to tell anyone here this. When you ask people to do something that clearly doesn't make them safer because they don't know what they're attesting to, and that's something that is not acceptable. So there's some pain, but there are ways that you can be an advocate to help with the pain, and that makes everybody stronger. But in order to make that work, you can't be the principal, because otherwise it's your pain and nobody cares. We can talk about access exceptions. Access exceptions are a huge place where things go wrong. Edge cases undermine your entire strategy, right? I have seen so many people implement access management systems where the normal, conventional access is done really, really well, thoughtful, everything is automated. But then you just have a backdoor to add exceptional access for anything else. And then what was the point of you having good, regular access? It's not fair when guests, and Shelley and I were just talking about this, it's not fair when guests get insider-like privileges, but they don't get insider-like responsibilities. So something that you can do with your exceptional access is to make sure that people who are close enough as a guest to be able to get inside access, they should also have to go through all your security awareness and compliance training. And it's also unfair when services use centralized authorization after you find that great tool that you want to launch, except when they don't. That's not fair, because what's the point? What can you say? What is the win at the end of the day? You haven't been able to say, hey, we closed this hole because we've really beefed up how we do access control into the system. So if you want to make guest access or exceptional access make sense, I think there's a few things that need to happen. The first one is it should be sponsored. Have an idea of sponsorship. It should be sponsored by somebody who can be held accountable for nonsense that happens with that account. And then you have to support the sponsor, because it's all well and good. You can get someone to be accountable, but that they are never going to say we don't need that access anymore if you do not give them a mechanism to save face. And what I mean by that is people are not going to reach out to their guest, a lot of times someone that they don't even know very well, to say, hey, do you really still need that access? They're asking me. No, they're just going to click the button, because it feels petty, it feels like a waste of time, it feels stingy, it feels awkward to have that conversation with someone. And a lot of people are not going to have an awkward conversation. So something that some of us in this room have worked on together that we implemented quite successfully with this was, if a guest account isn't being used, we actually don't make it renewable without a business justification. And then you give the script to the sponsor to say, hey, I'm happy to renew this. I'm being the good guy. I'm happy to renew this, but security is saying that I can't renew it because you haven't used it. And then because you've given them that extra information, it's easier for them to say, oh yeah, you know what, I don't need that. I haven't used it. And that's one less access that is hanging around. And then the last thing I want to say about this is exceptional access has to be accounted for in your access rules. It just does, because if you do not have rules to articulate who can have access, you no longer have the ability to automate deprovisioning, and that is an unacceptable cost. So if you want to make sure that people that don't follow the normal rules get in, make sponsored access a rule. That's a totally valid thing to do. But those are the kinds of things that you can do. This is not a full solution, but it's just trying to give ideas around specific things that we see happen a lot.
And Mary, we were talking about that second bullet there, helping sponsors save face. It doesn't always have to be in positive light. We've talked about a chargeback model for sponsored accounts, which gives sponsors an incentive to actually clean up their accounts by saving money for themselves, and an ability to say to the external person, like, by doing this, it's costing me money to continue to leave you on the network.
Yep. Time and time again, you'll find if there is not an incentive to clean up access, people will not clean up access. Everybody's busy. So that's a thing with access exceptions that I would encourage people to think about. How do you make sure that we don't just hand out exceptions like candy? How do you make sure that you've got someone who's responsible? How do you make sure that the person who's responsible has a motivation to tell you when that access is no longer needed? Here's something about access roles, and I think a few of you in this room know that I think that role-based access control is one of the biggest grifts in the identity and access management community. And it's not that it's not useful. Role-based access control can be great, but a lot of times security people talk about it like it's the gold standard, and at best, it's like, I don't know, like the tin standard? I don't know. It is a system, and it's a system that a lot of us have to live with in a lot of tools. It is extremely, extremely common to use role-based access control. For anyone who has not heard of role-based access control, it's the idea of saying, we are going to define these roles, which are bundles of attributes or bundles of access permissions, and we will assign those to people. That makes it easy to bulk assign and theoretically bulk remove, but it is inherently anti-least privilege because it bundles a lot of stuff together. It makes it very difficult to separate concerns, which is important for maintaining least privilege as your system grows, because it is designed to merge concerns. And the complexity snowballs, and you get kind of that effect where people stop taking it seriously because the system falls apart, and because everything's kind of broken and janky, nobody really cares about their roles anymore, and now you've got an explosion of roles that don't mean anything. It's very complicated for people to maintain, and we're creating new roles for everything. So we didn't really get that economy of scale that we were sold. So if you are in a situation where you need to work with a role-based access control system in an environment where role-based access control is not necessarily going to be it for you, one thing you can do is stop saying role. With the teams I've worked with, we've said, don't use that word, because it tends to be writing a check that you can't cash. When people say role, what they mean is a fantasy scenario where you have exactly the right access for someone defined. You're not being specific when you're saying, what are the permissions, what are the resources, you need to be more specific than that. And you can have a conversation without using the word role, and then turn them into roles. Another thing that's really, really important if you're trying to make role-based access control work at scale is to take a resource-based focus and not a user-based focus. And there's a million reasons for this, but it's very, very common for people to think of role-based access control as a persona game. Let me think of somebody who does I'm an engineer or I'm a SOC analyst. And then we're gonna say, what is all the access that a SOC analyst should have? That's a very, very common pattern. It's also very, very dangerous pattern. One of the reasons is you can get good governance around a resource. You cannot get good governance around a person. And even if you do, the people who are acting on behalf of those people, the authorities of that population, they are going to skew on the side of give these people more access. They need this in order to do their job. If you actually want to make sure that you have least privilege that scales, you have to say, let's make sure that we have the resource because we have good governance around that. We have a good principle that we can, work with to make sure as an advocate to say, let's make sure that people don't just blindly get access to things. And you can actually coerce a lot of times this resource action of instead of having something that is engineer, you could have something that was SIM reader or password admin, or something that says this is the resource, this is the action. So there are ways that you can articulate role-based access control that's not in terms of personas. And if you look at places where role-based access control works really, really well, document management. Everybody knows that, it makes sense, it's scalable, everybody gets it. But when you think about how it's done, editor, owner, those aren't personas. Those are actions on a resource or on a scope of resources. Nobody's saying, hey, I'm an owner of every document in this organization. They say, I'm an owner of this document, or I'm an owner of every document in this folder. So if you want to make that right, try to think about, okay, how do we make sure that we articulate roles? If that's the system that we have, let's make sure that we're thinking about it from a resource focus first. I'd be remiss to not also take shots at policy-based access control. Some of you might know I wrote the IDPRO Body of Knowledge Guidance on Policy-Based Access Control. I'm a big fan, but it is also not, let's use a good system and it's going to automatically fix all of our problems. No, it won't. Here's what happens when you use policy-based access control. And without getting too far into what that particularly includes, I would say policy-based access control, attribute-based access control, these are all things that look at observable attributes, observable things. We know what department you work in, or we know what your job code is, and we're going to say people in this job code get access to this thing. The problem with that is that when you have too tight of a connection between the attributes that your organization stores on people and access, you start getting some bonus access admins. Because people figure it out. People have the ability to update those attributes, and they do it with the best of intentions. They don't do it to undermine security. They don't know. They just say, oh, yeah, well, we just had HR update that person. They're not full-time, but we updated them to be full-time so that they could get access to that email thing. And that always seems to work. And pretty soon, your attributes start bending toward operational use cases, and that's not what they're intended to do at all. When that happens, assuming you've done a good job making sure that you've cultivated good principals, good resource owners, you now have resource owners who are saying, well, I don't trust the identity system because people are just going crazy. People are changing these attributes and I can't control it. And one of two things happen. They either get resigned and they stop caring about security, or more likely, they go underground and start their own shadow identity thing where they say, well, we can't trust this, so we're going to do our own thing. That's not helping you get all of your controls in the same place so that you have that visibility that you need as a security team. So if you want to make this right, it's a little bit easier. First thing is, let the identity people manage identity. Try to make it so that the resource people leverage identity. And make sure that there is always abstraction between the two. This is the biggest, the second biggest thing from this talk is a lot of times you say, okay, all staff members should have email. We can define staff. We're going to just make sure that every staff member gets the email permission. You have failed before you started if that is how you articulated the permission. And the reason for that is because you want to make sure that you don't have golden ticket service accounts, and you have the ability for the resource owner to exercise that agency around, hey, I need to have exceptions. I need to have a test account. I need to be able to add people to my policy that are locally. I want to use that good curated group that was created by HR for full-time staff. That's great. That is a great thing to do. But if they are bound together that tightly, then what do you have to do in order to get a service account? You have to make it look like a full-time staff member. Now it has access to everything in your organization that a full-time staff member can get, and that's where you get golden ticket types test and service accounts. And that is a really big problem that is incompatible with people actually taking responsibility for agency over a specific resource that they're responsible for. So, the bottom line, access management technology is great. I love it. I'll hope to talk with some of you about it later. But it's secondary to your ability to align incentives. You can't declare martial law on it. You can't do security and access control for your organization. You have to do it with them. And I think what this boils down to is if you show me how strong your access management game is, I will show you how strong your security culture is. Because it's all about making sure that people want to be secure, people feel like they have a fighting chance to actually, they're not just checking boxes, they're not just signing their name on something that they don't feel good about, but they're actively empowered to protect the resources that are in their purview. So that is my pitch, and I want to say thank you for the time. Make sure we have time to get announcements for the next one. Stay in touch.
That's it.
Oh, you have a question? Yeah, go
Can
for
you
it.
flip back to your slide with
Yeah.
the user, the agent?
Yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah.
principal?
This one?
Yep.
Yeah.
So what I like about this and what I want you to comment on, Mary, is the separation involving the ability for the user to bond with the agent to bond with the principal, and the principal to bond with the advocate. Because if the advocate is security, nobody wants to bond with the security office, right? Nobody wants to like be best friends with the security office, and it's also not scalable. But principals, being a much smaller group of individuals that are stuck in between, have the ability to form real allegiance with those security people in that advocate role, plus have the ability to form allegiance with the agents that they're supporting. Talk a little bit about that in this context of your...
Yeah, absolutely. I think you projected pretty well, Shelley, but the question about what is the relationship, because people do not want to bond with security, how do you deal with this? I kind of said at the beginning when we looked at this slide that one of the reasons that it's a danger to have this structure where security is the one making and enforcing all of the access things is because it is unbalanced. And it's unbalanced because the user, or the prospective wanting user, is going to get more access to the agent. They're going to have an easier time bonding. That's the social engineering vector. I will say, I don't think in this scenario that being best friends, being chummy, is actually the key thing. The key thing is proximity. The key thing is, are you thinking about security every day because you're seeing security every day? Is security on your mind, or do you only get one training in October and that's it for the year? Because it might be September, you might not have gotten that training for a while, and it's really easy to say, oh, you know, I know what this person is, I know, I've had that happen, I forget to bring my MFA codes with me too. So I think the important thing is that you're ever present, the thing is that you're accessible, and I think that that is something that has more lines potentially than I drew, but you see advocates are working with principals to design those programs, to make sure that they have what they need to be successful at access control. They're also doing trainings and providing tooling to the agents. They're also potentially interacting with users to say, hey, you gotta know, like, this is the policy. Don't yell at the agent. This is a security policy. And so I really think that from an awareness perspective, you're gonna see that security should be omnipresent. Security should be everywhere. But there is a conflict of interest when you have a situation where it's like, hey, everybody, listen to me. What we do is so important. Please help us. It's much more effective if you say, hey, here's the impact to your colleagues if you do it this way. And so that's what I would say, is it's about proximity, not necessarily that everybody thinks you're the hero. Galen?
You briefly mentioned zero trust. And
Oh, yeah.
every time that I learn about zero trust, I think, well, that's just good access control.
Yeah.
So as an access and as an identity expert, what's your opinion on zero?
Zero trust is a marketing term, and it really hurts our feelings. I mean, we've had policy-based access control for a very, very long time. And you should be, you know, I wrote the ID Pro guidance on this. It's on the internet. You can find it. I think it is appropriate at any scale of business. You don't have to be super mature or advanced or, you know, forward-thinking to do it. The whole point is you need to have symmetry. You need to be able to say, under these circumstances, if you're not in, you're out. You need to preserve that ability to do automated deprovisioning. And if you can't define the rules for being in, then you can't say, if you're not in, you're out. And that's one of the problems, is a lot of times we have these processes where people say, okay, well, when this certain event happens, then let's make sure that we give them access. Events change all the time. There's a lot of events that can happen. You really want to be more in a state-based mindset where you're saying, let's look at observable things. Because in a rule-based access control system, you really can't say, without having some sort of audit records that are not programmatic, that just like human logs saying, we chose to implement this at this time. As your policies change, you get all of this remnant access that you don't actually know why someone, that we have this carry forward on access that was appropriate at the time it was issued, but you'll never know now, so good luck getting rid of it. That is an uphill battle. If you are looking at more of a state-based, like policy-based model, what I would say about that is that you're actually able to project, if you want to change the policy, you can look and say, okay, if we change the policy, who would lose access? Because we have it worked out such that anyone who is not in is out. So the first thing I would say about Zero Trust is it's a marketing thing. The second thing I would say about Zero Trust is that I do think from an incentive perspective, there is, and I'm not going to render an opinion about this, but I will put it out there for people to consider. It is very fashionable right now for people to be bundling identity type trust with device type trust. And I think it's very, very hard to get your device posture and your identity posture to line up in one solid thing. So that is a complicated thing that I'm not going to give you a quick answer on, but I would say a lot of times Zero Trust promises that. That's the only thing that the identity side would never promise, because being able to say we're going to line up your device posture and your identity in one single thing is, you know, that is tricky, and I don't think people do it very well often. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? I think we're all right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the talk.